Hello, welcome to yet another Elden Ring lore related video. Sometimes in life we have to deal with some nasty things and it's just unavoidable. And the easiest way for a lot of people to deal with this is just to not think about it. And if we were trying to summarize the story of Elden Ring in one or two sentences, it might be something like, sorry for the spoilers, but everyone dies and there's no happy ending. That may be a truth, it may be kind of a brutal truth that nobody wants to hear, which is why we don't listen. Anthropologist Ernest Becker wrote a book somewhat related to this entitled The Denial of Death, and I'm certainly not here to promote every idea that he has in that book. I think the main idea has a little bit of relevance to the story here. He makes a claim in this book something like all of our cultural ambitions, like all our great buildings, monuments, and artistic achievements that we've had throughout time, these almost grandiose creations are some collective way of dealing with the fact that we're all going to just die at the end of the story. And because that reality is so painful, we create. Another way we can think about this is that society itself is all just one big cope. And if that conclusion is helpful to you, take it for what it is, just a theory. Point is, these nasty parts of life we just would rather not think about, and we definitely don't want to listen to YouTube videos about them, probably. Like and subscribe, especially when we're dealing with any actual real life tragic events. Sometimes this denial is just what we need to get us through a tough time. And one way we do this is by disappearing into fantasy worlds like this one. But not all fantasy worlds are created equally. Some fantasies show other parts of us that we may not want to look at. But I think, at least when this is done artfully, that fantasy and escapism can actually help us to move through a tough time instead of just being like pure escapism. And so what I'm doing here is definitely another just form of escapism. Like, I'm going to try to extract all of this meaning out of this fantasy world and video game, right? And in doing so, I'm certainly doing my own kind of coping. And so if we take a note from Ernest Becker, we may actually see that it is just cope all the way down, and that there's actually nothing more human than that. But this kind of long intro is just to get into the fact that we're going to be looking at some kind of gross things in this video. It's a dark universe and a very nasty story, and I don't think it makes any sense to try to hide these things, so I'm not going to be hiding them. We're going to be talking about them directly. Okay, that's the end of the warnings. Let's jump in. Just to kind of quickly recap where we've gone in the last few videos, we discovered the origins of Radahn, as I'm making it up. We decided that Radahn is like a puppet that Marika just kind of controls, that he was a puppet designed to infiltrate the Carians, and then he was molded by Marika with the corpse of the Fell God. We also learned previously that Mesmer and Melina were children of this Fell God Marika marriage. So these children were made when the fire was literally still alive. But when Marika no longer needs this Fell God, she simply destroys him and takes his body, which is totally normal. And then much later the game tells us that this body creates more children with Marika. The supposed children of Radahn and Marika are, of course, Millennia and Miquella. And while it may seem possible to reanimate a corpse and maybe do other things with a corpse, having children with a corpse seems maybe out of the question. But at this kind of weird place that we find ourselves, suddenly a character that I didn't know what to do with pops into my mind. And I'm talking about Fia, who, as we know from the story, is actually someone who seems to have babies with corpses. Right. Okay, so before we start talking about Millennia and Miquella, where I wanted to go with this video, I guess we gotta talk about Fia first. We meet Fia in the Round Table Hold, and she's associated with the characters of Dee, as well as Godwyn the Death Prince. Fia is yet another character representing some, bygone practices that Marika has banished in her current world. But, Fia seems like a nice lady. She gives us a hug. She involves us in her plot. And I'm definitely trying to avoid getting into Godwyn in this video, so I'm just going to leave it here for that part. What is Fia actually doing? It seems very possible that Fia has certain talents that allows her to literally bring the dead back to life. And as far as I can tell, this means that she's just having the baby of this dead person. And like maybe the same dead person is just reborn through this process. I mean, perhaps Fia's companion only died a small death. No doubt this is why we find her in Round Table Hold, that Marika must have employed Fia for such a purpose. This was a last-ditch effort on the part of Marika to rescue her apparent beloved golden child from his horrible fate. And I'm sure I'm going to do a Godwyn video at some point, but just to make a small point here, people say that he's Omega dead, but he's actually kind of like still half alive, so that's why he's so screwed actually. So it's kind of a subtle difference, but it might be an important one. But going back, and the point of this distraction was just to say that, having reproducing with corpses seems to be a thing that happens in this world somehow. So maybe, possibly, Marika, reproducing with a corpse isn't so weird, at least in the context of this very dark story. Let's just consider this for a moment, that Marika does have children with the corpse Radahn. Do we see any of Radahn in these children? And if Radahn himself is just an invention of Marika, then what does that even mean? Also, if the corpse is reborn in the Fia process, is the same corpse being reborn in Marika's version? So, like, are these children just copies of Radahn? And again, if Radahn is just this empty vessel for Marika, then we just translate that into something like the kids are also just like a vehicle for Marika, if they're like a copy of Radahn in that way. So I guess to the extent that we do actually see Radahn in these children, it might just be this kind of vessel nature. Also the red hair, but that's just kind of trivial. Like, to me, the red hair is just this carryover from Radagon's origins as being this defeated fell god, right? So, okay, so if Radahn is the parent of these two children, then we need another way to explain some other aspects of these kids that they can't be coming from Radahn. They've got to be coming from somewhere else. And that's the fact that these kids are plants. Yes. No, not like someone placed them somewhere, like, green things that live off sunlight and water. And of course, the idea of mixing plants and humans together would be pretty absurd if this was not a video game in a fantasy world. So luckily, we're not tethered by anything other than the rules that the game sets out for itself. And one of those rules was the Crucible. At least the way that I'm interpreting the Crucible. You have to maybe go back and watch that one if you are confused. But of course, it's not just any plant. This is the alien god plant that we all have known. I'm talking about the big golden boy himself, the Erd Tree. And if you're wondering, wait, what about Radahn? I thought he was the parent of these kids. I don't think so. I think Radahn was kind of like like a cuck, probably. See, while Marika is getting it from this tree, he just has to, sit there and watch, I guess. Marika just forcing him to watch. But don't feel bad for Radahn. He was a total freak. He was into it, so... But this idea of a three-way doesn't really make sense because we're still trying to figure out who the parent is. And as far as I know, you can't have a three-way child. That doesn't make any sense anywhere. So I guess the best way I can put all these things together is just, let's go back to the fact that Radahn is just this empty puppet that gets puppeted around by things. Normally the puppet master is Marika, but someone else could take over. So if the Erd Tree could somehow get inside Radahn, then they could just bang that way, right? So in this way, Marika's banging the Erd Tree, which is kind of like herself, and she's also banging Radahn, which is also kind of like herself. So she's kind of having a three-way with herself, kind of. The end eventual result of this three-way with herself is going to be, Miquella and Millennia. So that's totally normal. Let's just keep going here. I think we need a bit of a palate cleanser. Okay, so what the fuck am I trying to say? Okay, so what might it be to be a plant? What might it be like? What might it be like to be a plant? We may ask. There we go. What might it be like to be a plant? Okay. This is almost like one of those questions where you're supposed to just not have an answer, I think. Being a plant might be just like nothing. Like there's just nothing that it's like to be a plant. Okay, and so what's it like to be a human that's nothing? That has no interior? It seems like being a plant is similar to being an empty vessel in the sense that there's just nothing that it's like to be nothing. Like there's just nothing there. Maybe part of what Marika's reproducing in her kids is just this sense of nothingness that she may have. And just like Queen Marika was prepared by the horn scent to be their Empyrean figure, I think Marika's probably doing something similar to her own kids at this stage. Like she's preparing her own kids for some purpose. And that purpose is to carry Marika into the future. In this sense, Miquella and Millennia were never meant to be holding on to the same god as Marika. They were meant to hold on to Marika herself. So this would be just some other kind of weird twisted way that Marika lets herself live forever by basically injecting herself into her kids. And in the base game, we know that one of these Empyrean kids is going to fail, and that's Millennia. But now we're going to start getting into this weird idea where failure is actually success and the opposite. In the eyes of Marika, Millennia is going to be a failure because she ends up holding on to this rot goddess thing. Millennia had differentiated from Marika, so she just became something different that was her own thing, not Marika. And in this way, Millennia would become useless to Marika, so she would simply be abandoned. And the way I'm imagining this kind of from Marika's perspective is that probably that these Empyrean kids that she has last are sort of like a plan B or even plan C. And I'm assuming there that Godwin was kind of like the first choice. And that really what we get in the DLC is kind of the activation of this plan B, if you want to put it that way. And we're going to see that later in the DLC. So Miquella has this way of, correcting his course into being an Empyrean where Millennia didn't have that option. And in this sense, we could consider Millennia the more cursed one of the two. But now consider the fact that Millennia actually had her own followers in these whatever we call these shrimp boys. And as far as I can tell, she wasn't forcing these things to worship her. They just actually worshipped her. And if you compare that to Marika and Miquella, who rule by force and manipulation and black magic, I think we can start to ask here even, like, who's the real failure? Who's the best boss in the game to fight? But we're definitely going to come back to this idea later. So for now, let's just finish up with Millennia so we can move on to Miquella. Millennia is rejected by her mother in the sense that she can't be this Empyrean any longer, but she can still serve her mother in some way. Millennia would give up herself in the service of others, so that takes the form of protecting Miquella as well as serving her mother, Marika, who's obviously organizing the whole thing. And this type of self-sacrificing service towards others is something that we see in other places as well. In the context of sort of modern-day American screenwriting, there's this idea of the hero's journey. Connected to this is the idea of archetypal characters. And the archetype just means that certain types of characters have certain types of traits, and these kind of repeat across different stories. And one of these archetypes, though I'm not sure exactly where this comes from, but the Guardian is one particular version of this. What we're seeing, I think, in this story with the character like Millennia is this Guardian, but probably not directly. Like, for example, there's no real hero's journey that these Guardians ever get to go on. Instead, they just end up sacrificing themselves. And I think what the author may be accenting here is the flaws that show up in this type of archetype. They're very critical to the themes that I'm presenting here. It's a flaw that these particular people can't actually see in themselves. We see in these characters immense strength, a willingness to fight for and protect others. These people value one thing above all else, and that's winning, because they've learned that winning is what gets them the approval of others that they really desire. And because they're so driven in this one direction, they tend to sacrifice too much of themselves. They become people pleasers, and because of this, others who would seek to exploit them have an easy way to do it. The type of exploited guardian that we see in this story simply becomes a tool for others. With no hero's journey of their own to undertake, they instead become stagnant and rot and decay is what we see. And again, that's Millennia. And again, it's the guardian figure's blindness that actually causes this whole problem. But now let's switch to another character who I think, like Millennia, also fits very well into this kind of guardian archetype. And that character I'm talking about, of course, is General Radahn. So just like Millennia, I think Radahn's just going to be following his mother in a sort of blind way. Oh, and here I mean Marika, not Rennala, obviously. He just kind of abandons Rennala. One more thing that we know about Radahn that I think is really key to bring up here is the fact that Radahn is really trying so hard to be Godfrey, the greatest warrior to have ever lived. Radahn's trying to live up to that. When we learned that Millennia had been helping Miquella in this whole plot, Millennia actually says to Radahn something about how Miquella is waiting for him. There's actually a few different ways we can interpret this statement. First would be like, oh, Radahn already knows about this and Millennia is just like reminding him. And in this way it reads like she's taunting him. But the other possibility is that Radahn didn't know anything about this and she's still taunting him, but he's like, what are you talking about? Like, in the sense he has no idea what's going on. And I think that part has to be true, because otherwise I don't think he'd be even dying like an honorable death. And that part seems to be important for what comes later, maybe. But we could also interpret this as Radahn did know about it the whole time, that this was just something imposed on him by his mother Marika once again. No matter what he's doing, as long as he's serving Marika, he's doing something honorable. And so just like Millennia, Radahn is sort of trapped by his own virtue. Because Radahn never questioned anything, he just kind of blindly accepted what he was told. So bound by honor, he would become the tool for terrible power. And the person using Radahn obviously just shifts from Marika to Miquella. So we've got these two warrior figures who are going to clash, and the result is going to be stalemate. Because for these guardian warrior type characters, losing is actually like the worst possible outcome. And when these hyper competitive characters lose, we can see something that almost looks like trauma. In both cases, with Millennia and General Radahn, we have characters who are setting themselves standards that are just impossible to actually meet. They think somehow they can please everyone all the time, which is, of course, cope. And while setting an impossible standard for yourself may be a way of achieving something, like it might be one of these beneficial lies we tell ourselves, we can see when this illusion is inevitably shattered that these particular warrior types don't cope too well with it. And once again, we can see how this self-delusion or golden lie has a double edge to it. The same thing that drives these people to achieve great things is exploited by others who want to use them for their own needs. And because of how cope works, they don't even know that they're being tricked. And now I think we can ask the question of like, why is Marika doing this to her children? Why does Marika continuously reward loyalty with just like the worst betrayals? Like from this outside perspective, she just seems to be like pure evil, but is that really her whole story? I think not. We're going to have to come back to Marika later. I mean, I have an idea for probably the last video. It would be something like the trial of Marika, but we'll see when we get there. We can ask why Marika does this to her children, but we can also ask like why her children put up with it. Why does the abandoned keep going back to the abandoner? What is the recurring theme of this video? So if you want to actually answer like why did Marika do this to Millennia and Radahn, is just, well, I think all of that was just in service of setting up Miquella for later, probably. And if we want to take the self-sacrificing nature of the guardian spirits seriously, we can see that both Millennia and Radahn are in a way fulfilling their purpose, like they're living up to who they want to be. However, was this a goal that they actually came to on their own? Like, was this something that they really wanted, or is it something that was maybe kind of put in their head by somebody else? Somebody who maybe would benefit from their competition, and someone who also was probably not telling them the whole truth of what they were doing. We get this scene in the DLC where Miquella is sitting by this chair and he tells us,
Lord brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place.
but for sure someone has told him this, and I mean, it's Marika. Because of course, who else would it be telling little Miquella what he has to do, right? Miquella doesn't seem to know what to do, but what Miquella does seem to understand is that he's going to need help, and help he receives mostly from Millennia, at least in the first half of the game. In the second half of the game, Millennia would be abandoned, and Miquella would have a whole new gang of followers. And I think in this abandoning, we're already starting to see Marika showing up within Miquella. Miquella, much like his mother, repays his followers with betrayal. Note that Millennia's Shrimp Boy followers have themselves thought that they've been abandoned by Millennia, but in reality, Millennia is just not being told like what's going on here. Like Miquella must have told these Shrimp Boys that Millennia abandoned them, but that's a lie. It's Miquella who's done the abandoning. Because like we talked about before, sometimes success can be failure, and what Miquella is going to do is a kind of colossal success, or at least that's from one perspective. But before we get into like late stage Miquella, let's kind of talk about where this is starting again. Miquella is, you know, quite an interesting character, I think, and he's also one who has several layers to him. So let's get into those a little bit more. I'm not sure if this would be like an archetype, but like a child emperor type figure. Like, not exactly in the fun Eddie Murphy way, but kind of similar. So here we have a child, like any child, who has had all the responsibilities of the world just sort of dropped on their shoulders. And to me, the immense weight of this just makes it so absurd to think that a child can take all this responsibility on their own. And I think this is literally the weight that Marika is dropping on Miquella's shoulders at this moment. And in this way, Miquella really has no choice but to try to get help from other people. And we can also probably recognize that this child emperor was not going to be the first choice for anyone. Most likely the first choice had always been the golden boy. Again, no, not in the fun Eddie Murphy way. We're instead talking about Prince of Death, Godwyn. And I think it has to be after Godwyn is killed that we get this scene on the chairs where Miquella finds out what's going to be happening in the future. So Miquella now is this kind of plan B character that was never supposed to go anywhere, really. Now he's meant to just kind of carry the whole world on his shoulders, right, by Marika again. But if it wasn't already clear to you, we should know that Miquella has actually already failed before we even get to see him. Because had he not failed, we would never even be in the game, because we the Tarnished are like Marika's last resort. Like, we come in at the very end of time, basically. And when we do get the DLC and we do get to go find Miquella, we're actually kind of giving him like a second chance. So this failed Plan B character gets a second chance by us to succeed where he failed before. And what Miquella had failed to do before was to be completely consumed by Marika. He had failed in his purpose to become Marika's vessel, or at least Marika's vessel as he's imagining it through his little mind. Because both Miquella and General Radahn have this property about them where they seem to imitate others. Like, this mimicry that they have tends to be like a major part of their person. In both cases, they're simply copying someone else without really understanding, what they're copying, or maybe even like why they're copying. They both simply learned like there's something they can do to get the results that they want, and because of this, they're just conditioned to repeat it over and over. And in this way, both of these characters behave very much like an artificial intelligence, where AI is just kind of mindlessly doing its thing for the sake of someone getting clicks. Miquella's also doing something similar, but in his case, there's no clicks. There's just this thing in his head that he thinks is clicks. So that's where Miquella ends up, but like, was he always like that? And I think probably not. This is another layer of the tragedy. So back to this success as failure thing once again. On the one hand, we have failed Miquella living in obscurity as the Saint Trina character. He had failed because he had not become this Empyrean for Marika. He had instead succeeded in becoming this other thing, which was Saint Trina. And that really he would have been better off just failing, probably. Because in order for Miquella to succeed, like in order for him to like really follow his mother, he has to abandon Saint Trina, which is also a representation of his love. So as Miquella follows his mother, he abandons his love and he abandons himself at the same time. Miquella again becomes the god that he was created to be, this sort of empty vessel of just pure nihilism. Miquella is death itself, presented as life, or at least this is how it would appear to his followers who are under his spell. They may have thought that a lot of what I was talking about sounded like narcissism, and that's because I think it is one of the major themes that we're looking at in this part of the story, at least. And the game's not exactly subtle about these connections. I mean, very directly, Miquella is this eternal child character, which is shown to be abnormally charming and manipulative, and sort of sucks everyone into his world and his reality. So all of these things, like, in my understanding, are pretty heavily associated with the construct of narcissism. But really specifically what we're talking about here is Marika being this narcissistic mother who creates the same thing in her child eventually. And now to go back where I started with this video to talk about how we cope with things. And now we can connect these two ideas because, at least in theory, narcissism is another one of these copes that just kind of goes wrong. And maybe if we put a few more points in empathy, we could see that, Miquella was just driven to this. It wasn't his fault. So I think grant him forgiveness, yes, but only after we've killed him, metaphorically, by completing the game, probably. Because defeating narcissism in the real world is a lot more difficult, and we don't have any developers who can nerf crossover slash for us. Sometimes this means walking away from people who we might not want to walk away from. Or maybe we have to look at some ugly aspects of ourselves. Maybe we don't like what we see, so instead, some of us really do believe a kind of golden lie. We believe our own bullshit because our bullshit protects our feelies. And some of us have to end up dealing with a lot of bad feelies. We believe our own bullshit so much that eventually there's just nothing left but bullshit. And we know from completing the game that the final boss is pretty much nothing but bullshit. So now you have a lore reason for that. And while we can definitely recognize that Miquella has lost some part of his humanity, this golden lie that caused him to lose his humanity was itself something very human. In his head, he's doing something amazing for the world, where in reality, he's just destroying it. But instead, if we just not had this DLC and we just left Miquella alone, like he could have actually just been Saint Trina and he could have been maybe happy. I mean, he might have been dealing with some kind of drug addiction as another one of these out of controlled copes. But as painful as it may have been to hold on to, he would have still had love. And it's actually this discarded love that tells us the real truth about Miquella. But that's kind of the tragedy of Miquella, at least the way I see it. Thanks so much for listening, and will there be a next time? Who's to say, really?